and welcome to Lore Watch, roundtable freeform discussion about lore and our favorite media. I'm your host, Joe Perez, one of several lore-focused folks from Blizzard Watch, and I've got my marvelous co-host with me today, Matt Rossi. How are you doing today, Matt?
Gibbida-weebida-dub.
That was definitely words or sounds that you made.
It was noises. It wasn't words, I don't think. If it was words, I don't know what language it was in. So
fair enough. Well, friends, we are going to
tell
be...
you the time that I made up a language for my stuffed Cthulhus to talk, and now it's like a thing between me and my wife?
No, but
No, it's like it's some stuff from Call of Cthulhu and some stuff that's just noises I make. But it's like and I think it's cute sounding. She thinks it's cute sounding. It may be because we have the tiny little Cthulhu dolls right there. Like, you know, we're usually like going with them in our hands. We're hugging up on the larger Cthulhu doll. I used to have the black and silver one. You remember that one?
Yes, I do actually.
Yeah, I used to have that, but the person I was dating at the time, which was not my wife, obviously, took it when she left.
Yeah.
I mean, she broke my heart, but then she stole my Cthulhu doll. I'm like, oh. Anyway, yeah, go ahead and do the thing we normally do now. I know I'm ranting off on a completely different thing. I'm just, it's me. You guys know who this guy is.
Well, we are going to be doing, not really making up our own language, though sometimes it feels like we are, especially with some of the things we talk about. We're going to be answering some more of your questions, our wonderful listeners. If you have questions for this or any of our podcasts, be sure to send them in to podcast@blizzardwatch.com. Specify the show that it is for in the subject line, and then any special pronunciation for your name in the body of the email. If you want to hit us up on Discord, we have 2 channels set aside. One is the Q and Podcast Questions channel. Same rules apply. Put what show it's for and any special pronunciations of your name. And if you are a Patreon subscriber, as a way of saying thank you for helping financially support us, we have the Patron Q and Podcast Questions channel, which we tend to look at first as just that little extra thanks. But without further ado, our first question actually comes from our friend 6K. How would each Starcraft faction do against their counterpart in Warhammer 40k? So, the 3 primary factions of Starcraft, you have your Terrans or humans, you have your Protoss, and then you have your Zerg. The equivalents on the 40k side would be the Imperium, in conjunction to the Terrans there, or opposition to the Terrans. The Eldar are probably the closest.
I was thinking Eldar, yeah. I mean, there's some other factions you can make a case for, but I think Eldar is probably the easiest one to go with.
Yeah, I mean, with the weird spirituality and they use psionic magic. I'm generalizing. It's not exactly psionic magic, but it might as well be close enough to it. And then the Zerg with the Tyranids. So I will let Matt give his opinions first because I have plenty.
Zerg are going down.
I would agree with that.
Terrans are going down. Protoss stand the best chance. I still feel like the Eldar... The thing with the Warhammer factions is, A, they're much more aggressive and militaristic than the Starcraft factions. That may seem insane if you've only played Starcraft, but yeah, no, the Warhammer 40k groups, every single one of them is... I mean, there's a reason that the catchphrase for the game is, in the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. I mean, this is what they do. They all just fight all the time. The Zerg can't, do to the Tyranid what they do to everybody else, which is assimilate them and bring them their genetic diversity in, because the Tyranid are doing that even better. The Tyranid are just better than the Zerg. They're just the Zerg plus. It's not... If anything, the Tyranid would destroy or assimilate the Zerg. And if you decided you're not going to use the Tyranids, let's go with Chaos Orcs or something. Even worse matchup for the Zerg. The Zerg are basically dead here. The Terrans might not get destroyed if they were willing to join the Imperium. Like if they bent the knee, then they, because they're human. The Imperium is not a good place to live, but it's extremely human supremacist. If they come up on a splinter group of humans that, are like 40k, what are you talking about? We're not that far in the future. We're from, are you from Earth? Yes. Right, then you are part of the Imperium of Man. Submit. That's how that matchup would go. If they bend the knee, they'll live. If they don't, they're probably all dead. Because the scale of how many people the Imperium can throw at a problem and what those individual people can do. Oh, who's the one that's like, he was the head of the Salamanders?
That would be the Primarch Vulcan.
Vulcan by himself. If you just had Vulcan and the Salamanders going into the Terran space in StarCraft, he'd be more likely not to wipe them all out, but he by themselves, that group could conquer all of the Terrans in StarCraft. By themselves, not even all, like none of the other parts of the Imperium, which is vast. The Imperium is huge. Yeah, so they're getting absorbed or they're getting destroyed. The thing about the Protoss is they have what the Eldar don't, in that they have complete, before the Link was destroyed, they had complete and total synchronicity of thought.
Mm-hmm.
So they could do things to counter Eldar advantages, but the Eldar have a lot of advantages. The Eldar have been holding off the Imperium for a long time. They've successfully held off the Tyranids. They fought off the Orcs. I mean, Eldar, what they lack in numbers, they possess in guile, tactical acumen, and they've also got the Dark Eldar. They're not chummy with the Eldar, like the Eldar and the Dark Eldar. It depends on the version of the game too. Like, this is the problem with talking about Warhammer 40k. There's a lot of variation here, but yeah, I don't see it going like a victory with the Protoss. I could see the Eldar deciding there's no point to us fighting you. You don't have anything we want, and you're not trying to wipe us out, so there's no goal to this. I could see that, but if we're just saying screw all motivation, who wins in a fight, I'm going to give it to the Eldar. So pretty much, I'm just saying that Warhammer 40k would just rocket over StarCraft, just straight up. That's my statement.
So, funnily enough, I agree with 2 out of the 3. So, Terrans, I think you are correct in that they would either bow down to the Imperium or they would be absorbed. And don't forget, there are 2 different divisions or factions of humans, because you have, and I don't remember the StarCraft stuff, so I'll look to Matt to correct me if I'm wrong. But there was essentially what was like the Confederacy and the Terrans proper.
The Terrans are technically the Earth-based ones. No, the Confederacy is the Earth-based one. The Terrans are actually descendants of people from Earth who came to the Corporaloo sector and then were cut off for a long time.
Yeah. So
there's 2 groups. Either of those groups would lose to the Imperium, in my opinion. Just so many people and so much power in the Imperium.
Yeah, so that's the thing, too, is like the scale of the Imperium. So just Space Marines alone, which are similar to Terran Marines, except for the fact that they are genetically modified on top of being in powered armor with top-notch or current generation technology or armaments. There's 1 million active Space Marines that are known.
Space Marines are not they're an elite group. They're not the full military.
Correct. Of those, there are also sub-factions that are not accounted for in total. The 1 million of them is an estimate. Their ships, each of their ships tends to be the size of a city, if not larger. Not only do they have the Space Marine, not only do they have all of that technology, you have the Sisters of Battle, which are a fanatical group of essentially militant church nuns that are in service to the God Emperor. You have the Mechanicum, which makes not all of the armaments for the Space Marines, but also all the armaments for the Astra Militarum, which is another sub-faction, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But they also fight. They have warriors that they create, and they're spread throughout the galaxy. Their ships are just as large. Their armaments are just as large. The Astra Militarum is essentially the human military of the universe of the Imperium, where these are, whether they're conscripted or volunteers, they're varied across all of the planets of the Imperium, and they are innumerable. They outnumber the Space Marines, but even then, their numbers, the Space Marines are more powerful than them in almost every capacity. And the amount of tanks and heavy weaponry that they have available to them is vast. And they usually travel with the Space Marines on those giant ships of the size of cities with their armaments. This also doesn't include the Titan houses or the Night houses, which are massive engines of war that are as much alive as those that pilot them. And we're talking like, you think Godzilla's big, these things put Godzilla to shame as far as sheer scale and size. And
except for the one that is a whole planet. That Godzilla is bigger.
That is correct. But you talk like, and I know somebody's gonna be like, well, what about the Thor and the Odin? Like, those are really big mechs. Those are really big mechs that the Terrans have. They're still not as big as the smallest knight available to the Imperium of Man. The Armigers are actually bigger than that.
And he hasn't even mentioned yet that the Imperium of Man also has variant humans that it has engineered over the years, including essentially ogres.
Yep,
that are physically strong enough to rip a human being in half with like not a lot of effort. And then that's just one of many of them. Like they've got like a dwarf type group too.
No, those are a separate faction now.
Okay.
But the space dwarves exist, but they're
like the little rat-like ones or something.
Ratlings. Those are ratlings. They're halflings. They're essentially they're sniper halflings, but they're part of the Imperium.
And the Imperium can call upon all this, and we haven't even talked about like Vulcan and the other Primarchs yet.
And that's that's the other thing too. Now it's taken into effect that the Emperor of Mankind, and I'm not going to spend too much time going through the lore on this, but I mean, it's been a while since I've had a question asked about this. I'm gonna revel in it a little bit. The Emperor of Mankind made what are essentially templates of demigods. If the Emperor is a god himself that is truly immortal and has power on par with other entities that are god level powers, these are his children. And he made 20 of them. 18 survived. Several of them fell to chaos, but several of them stayed loyal. And of those, many of them are actually active right now. 2 of them are actually active in the Imperium, and they're 2 of the most dangerous ones. You have Reboot Gulliman, who is the master tactician of all things. We're talking about a man whose brain is faster than a machine and is coordinating an interstellar war, fighting against the forces of chaos and the forces of the Tyranids and all the other what they call Xenos threats at the same time, while keeping the Imperium running more efficiently than it ever was before he was brought back from his stasis. Now, Lionel Johnson is also back from his wherever he was. And he has returned much older, much wiser, but he is a tenacious tactician as well and is leading frontal assaults while his brother manages the Imperiums and coordinates everything else. And we're talking about demigods striding physical planets and forms. And when I say demigods, I'll use this as an example. Lionel Johnson has a power, a latent power, because magic exists in this universe as well. It is far more than what the Protoss show in Starcraft or even the Zerg are capable of with what little limited things they have. He can just disappear into a realm called the Forest and appear on any planet anywhere that has a wooded area, period. Doesn't matter where it is, doesn't matter how far away it is, he can do this. And he can take however many people he wants with him. Which means if he wants to take 1 million Space Marines through this interstitial realm and show up in the forest behind enemy lines, he can do this. And just walk through. And again, now the other thing is like Psykers are another thing. While the Imperium doesn't really like to use them if they can avoid it, Psykers are essentially the magic users of the realms. They cast powerful spells. They wield the powers of the warp, which is a reality-altering force. If the Terrans didn't bow down to them, in a matter of days, the Imperium of Man would completely overrun the Terrans. Zerg, on the other hand, are an interesting one because they're often portrayed as like the big bad biomass-consuming thing, and Tyranids put them to shame. Tyranids are innumerable. These are the beasts beyond the realm of stars. These are the beasts from the black space in between. All they do is consume. That is their entire purpose. Their purpose is to consume the entire universe, convert it into biomass, and by doing so, replicate their race across everything. When they reach to a planet, they literally eat everything and use it as essentially building blocks to make more of itself. The Zerg will not be able to keep up with it. And the Zerg have had that hive mind in the past. The Tyranids also have that hive mind, but it's even larger and more connected than what you saw with the Zerg. And even when Kerrigan was running around as the queen, their connection, their magic, their mastery of that connection is nigh absolute. A creature, any of their gene stealers, any of their creatures, their warriors can be born on a planet and instantaneously have access to all knowledge that has existed before it and moving forward. They tend to not be sort of independent creatures. It's one giant mass. The Protoss, I actually do think, would potentially win against the Eldar. And here's why. While the Eldar have access to the Eldar and the Drukhari, or the Eldari and the Drukhari are their new names, but the Eldar and Dark Eldar, they're very limited in number. They don't really procreate at any sort of speed, and they were devastated with the birth of the god Slaanesh. In fact, when Slaanesh was born, from their excess and their revelry and their sort of like naughty behavior, it consumed most of their population, to the point now when they die, they try to shove their friends' souls into soul shards, which they can use to make machines later, but they essentially don't really propagate their own race anymore. They also no longer have home planets. They are all confined to their, what they call tomb ships or void ships, crystal ships that go through the universe, they've been trying to terraform planets, make it suitable for their own life, but then the Imperium comes along and takes it from them. They're the weakest in number comparatively. And I do think that with the psionic powers of the Protoss and their ability to manufacture and manifest not just like ships, but automatons as well, because don't forget, the Protoss make stuff like the Dragoons and other entities that, I forgot what their carrier capital ships are, the ones that make the swarms of things. But all those are like robots. They're automated stuff. The Eldar really don't do that. If they were to go head to head, I think the Protoss could outproduce them in a way that would essentially wipe the Eldar off the face of the universe. That's my 2 cents. Is there anything you think I missed or anything that you would want to add for any of that, Matt?
I'm just going to say this. I don't disagree with what you're saying. But I forgot something that I shouldn't have. The automated stuff that they make is all well and good, but they have one thing that is actually, I think, would really be dangerous for anybody fighting them. They can make Templars.
Yeah.
Or Archons. I can't remember the name at the moment, but you know who we're talking about, because if you saw the Legacy of the Void trailer, when 2 of them became one gigantic purple, blue, glowing thing that shoots lasers out and screams power overwhelming. Yeah, and that took that, giant Zerg and just smashed its face in. Any of their psychics who are sufficiently gifted can do that. And that's sort of a deal changer. I hadn't thought of that. So I'm going to cautiously be on Joe's side, because I do think the Eldar they're more militaristic, and also they're desperate. But then again, I also think that's a reason why there's much more of a chance of the Eldar saying there's no profit in this for us. Why are we doing it? And the Protoss would be like, well, okay, we don't want to fight you either. And just, I could see there being skirmishes, but I could also see the 2 groups just saying there's no point to this. I don't get anything. We don't get anything from fighting you. You don't get anything from fighting us. Why don't we just not? Not that they'd become buddies, but that they would just simply not have a reason to really fight, if that makes any sense. It's not like the Terran Imperium conflict, that the Terrans of the Copperloo sector are going to try to maintain their independence because that's what they do. Mm-hmm. When United Earth showed up, they immediately tried to, but against the Imperium, they are absolutely screwed. Like, Joe could continue on for another half an hour with stuff that the Imperium could pull out of its butt. Like, the Imperium has things like, we didn't even talk about the fact that the God Emperor himself is the reason that the Imperium can travel through the warp, or even has psychers.
Oh yeah, they have faster than light travel that goes through a realm called the warp, which means that they can send their ships basically anywhere they need to go. Within reason, the lore of the current universe is a little wonky on it. But
there's just, so the scale is, the problem is that Warhammer 40K's scale is a lot bigger.
It is massive because it spans the entirety of our known universe and then some.
Yeah. It's so the scale is much larger, and so it's a mismatch unless you're saying like we have a unit of, say, a couple hundred Space Marines versus a unit of equivalent forces from Starcraft. That's different than these factions are fighting, if that makes any sense. If you're trying to balance it so that the unit scales are about the same, I still give it to the 40K people time more often than not, but it would be a lot fairer.
Yeah, I would agree.
But regardless, I think we've both said what we've said, and our disagreement on the Eldar versus Protoss isn't a very strong one. Like, I can see ways the Protoss could win it. And you're right about the Eldar. I had not thought about that. I thought they had kind of said they were starting to get more higher numbers, but I mean, there are so many additions to the game and so many variations. It's really easy to be behind on lore.
Oh, yeah. And with the new edition just releasing, the lore is getting refreshed across the board. So while I'm reading it, I don't expect that everybody else is. But I do expect our friend Corn will probably be asking questions in the near future.
Yeah.
But we're going to move on to the next one, which comes from Octomos. Loved the new What If episode, and it played into something I've been thinking about. The cosmology seems to all be founded on the concept of struggle for dominance in a system that needs balance. Do you think that this is what the first ones intended? If there is something to come that threatens all of reality, the war in Warcraft could be honing reality into a weapon with Azeroth at its center, or possibly its intended avatar of sorts. And the world soul seems to manifest with a kind of rainbow energy, all of the forces combined. Just something to discuss. What do you think, Matt?
I think I immediately start thinking of the various Power Rangers, like Sentai team that's going to get formed out of the champions of various Azeroth. But, I mean, the problem is, of course, that we're speculating. So the true answer is got no idea. But while speculating, I'll say that I think that looking at it for a struggle of dominance is certainly one way you could do it. And I think that's the lens that some people use. Like, I think it's definitely the lens that Denathrius was using. He sees it as a struggle for dominance. But I think it's just as possible to look at it from another perspective, which is that balance isn't static. People often think of balance as this is perfectly balanced. This person on this side of the lever is exactly balanced to this force on the other side of the lever, so it neither goes up or down. But balance isn't always that. Sometimes balance is the ebb and flow of the tides. Sometimes the tide comes in, the tide goes out. There's ups and downs, there's peaks and valleys. The forces are in opposition to each other, and that means sometimes one of those forces is the one pushing, and so then it becomes the one pulling. Joe was going to speak, so I'm going to let you.
Well, I was going to say, no, you're it's something I'll talk about a little bit more, but I mean, it's also balance can come from tension as well.
Yeah. I'm going to use a really weird example here because I've been thinking about it a lot. You guys remember the Ocean's Gate sub disaster, right?
I think it's hard for anybody to forget about that.
The reason that the sub imploded is that it was made out of carbon fiber materials that, when exposed to pressure, when compressed, could delaminate, and the delamination causes fracture and failure points. And the reason that it does this when it's used for a sub, but not for, say, an aircraft, is when it's going up against expression pressure, like when the inside of the craft has oxygen or an atmosphere in it, and the outside is vacuum, the pressure pushing outwards, it's strong against that kind of pressure. That is perfectly designed for that sort of compression. It does not, if anything, it gets stronger. It doesn't delaminate, but it delaminates from the other side due to the nature of the composite. The cosmos is like this. Certain aspects of the cosmos are providing both kinds of pressure to keep it stable, but there's problems in the way the universe is currently configured. Stuff has happened that has caused some stuff to not be, instead of using the proper material for the proper forces, some forces are applying pressure in places it was never intended they should be. I think that the example, the biggest example of this is the Burning Legion. Mm-hmm. I think the Burning Legion is a real example of trying to take your space flight composites and take them into the ocean, which has the exact opposite conditions. The deep space there's almost nothing there. It's almost a complete void. And as a result, anything you bring out there, you have to bring it out there. And so the compression is always going to be from the thing you're trying to keep contained. The force is attempting to disperse itself. So the compression it's tension, and tension works great. But sometimes you got pressure, like you're down at the bottom of the ocean, you're suddenly looking at 500, 600, 700 times the atmosphere of Earth, to the point where you're looking at several times the atmospheric pressure of Jupiter, which is, of course, 1,000 Earths across, but it's almost entirely gas. There's probably like an Earth-sized core that is pure metallic hydrogen. The rest of it is all gas. These are different conditions. Only Azeroth seems to be able to figure out a way to balance all these completely different forces. And I don't know if that's on purpose or not, but I'm starting to wonder if it is in fact the design is to create by basically creating a world that is the place where all these different forces can contend. It's not necessarily for the purposes of the forces. It's to create beings that can contend in and with all of them. You're trying to make, it's like trying to figure out, okay, we need a material that can do everything. It can do this. It can do this condition. It can do that condition. That's what I look at when I see Azeroth. I think of it as like a kind of a gigantic cosmic hatchery to create a being, or beings in the case of, maybe we're all being like part of it, to create beings that can stand up to or against or with any of these things, and therefore come up with a way to harness all of them to use against what's coming. If that makes sense. So it's sort of what you're talking about with the idea of making a weapon, but it's less making a weapon and more like trying to come up with a way to make a universe that can deal with it.
Yeah, like, and I think that's kind of where I'm at with it too, right? Like I'm not necessarily certain or confident that the first ones were intentionally making weapons, because a lot of what's out there doesn't really seem to be based around that. It seems like what we learned in Zereth Mortis, what we learned in the Shadowlands, and then what we're continuing to learn about Titans and the universe and everything else around it is maybe that the first one's more intended to try to create a self-healing system, or a system that was, I don't want to say like in checks and balance, but was in sort of that perfect mode of tension. Because if you think about it, and this is kind of where I keep coming back to on the whole balance thing, items in tension are balanced. They, like, you look at the tensegrity tables and chairs and stuff like that were popular not too long ago. They essentially use that to become stable or, strength load bearing items. However, if a force comes and sort of pushes on it from a different angle that isn't from the direction of that tension, it throws it out of balance and throws it askew, and those systems can fail. And it feels almost like the universe was set up to be this like perfectly tensioned and imbalanced thing, and maybe something has kicked it off kilter, whether it was us or the events that happened with the jailer or anything else, that sort of skew it a very specific way. I often talk about Azeroth being this weirdly perfect focal point on the cosmology chart, because it is this thing that touches literally everything. It's equidistant, essentially, or at least my theory is that it is equidistant from every one of the forces, which is why when you go to, you have a big fell outbreak in there, it's able to self-mend. It's why the entities can use it. It's why the entities can touch void. It's why the entities can touch light. It's why the entities can touch the realm of nature and arcane and everything in between. We sort of are at that weirdly specific point of perfect balance in that regard, which is why when things destabilize on Azeroth, and they do quite often, it almost self-corrects. It almost self-heals and pushes itself back into
if you were looking
alignment.
At it from a cosmic scale, then you would have to say it was self-correcting, because it's us mortal beings that half the time apply the corrective force. Mm-hmm. It's like the universe has created a species of beings, or a whole continuum of species of beings, who, when they see these out of control things happening, immediately apply counter pressure in the right direction. Maybe they don't apply it always as gracefully as one might like, but they do apply it.
Yeah, and I think that's more it than the idea of Azeroth being molded into a weapon, because I don't know that was necessarily the intention. Now, there might be something to it where the first ones were creating a universe that could survive what was to come if they knew about it, because apparently Zolval does, and other entities seem to have this rough idea that there's something coming that is not great, and maybe it's part of those devourers, maybe it's something else, but it is something that seems to be more dangerous than the light and the void and everything in between. And maybe their intention was to create something to deal with that, or maybe their intention was to create a self-balancing universe, and the fact that some of it is weaponized is just an artifact of that self-balancing. Like Matt's pointed out, that we are a force of sort of that rebalancing. We are kind of weapons, but we weren't necessarily created originally to be weapons. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, no. if you look at the immune system of a living person, T cells are obviously not a weapon. They're a tool for our bodies to stave off infection. But on the scale of the infection, they're certainly like an aggressive opposing force, right? They go in and they screw these things up. They attack bacteria. They attack viruses, and that's kind of what we're talking about. I mean, you look at that as them creating a weapon, or you could look at it as them creating an immune system.
Mm-hmm.
If they wanted beings, they wanted something that could react on the scales necessary. So you don't have like a Titan coming in and showing, oh, I should get rid of that, and ripping half of a world apart just to get rid of it. You want something that can operate on the scale you need. You need things at the Titan level. You need huge cosmic forces, but you also need smaller, more tactical dealing with things. Like, human bodies, we have a lot of different systems to keep them running. Like, our bodies are made to keep us going as long as they can. And it could be similar to that. I mean, like I said before, I think there's different lenses you can use to look at it all. I definitely think you could look at it like a weapon system or weapon development, but I also think you could look at it and say, it's like a life form. Or you could look at it and say it's like, what do they call it? Cascading?
Yep.
When computer systems are failing, one of the things they can do is have a system that goes, okay, we're having a failure, and shunts everything over to something else. It's another way to look at how balance works. You can see it like today in our power grids and so forth. There's like cascade systems that will push, okay, we now can't use that, go over here. I mean, there's lots of different lenses to use this, to look at it, in my opinion.
I would tend to agree. And as far as the rainbow energy, I will always love that because, I think that it is always funny that Azeroth sort of represents itself in sort of the multicolored aspect, because it really is sort of that thing where all things touch. So, but we'll probably find out a lot more about this in specific as we move into the War Within, or the War Within, right? Yeah, War Within.
Was it the World Soul Trilogy or something?
Yeah, the World Soul Trilogy, but I think specifically in the War Within, we're going to start getting some more leads on what that is and what that intention is, and we'll see how that goes from there. But I think we're going to move on, and this one is from our friend Vertigree. Dear Perceivers of Precipitation, I was listening to your latest Cyberpunk special about V and the Relic, and was reminded of the ways Warcraft has some not un-cyberpunky aspects, with all the sufficiently analyzed magic indistinguishable from science. Editing of the mind and soul via anima manipulation, the jailer doing the same thing as a horrifying Black Mirror episode to millions, getting ripped out of your body and controlling a corpse through a truncheon, the mechanomes and the undead replacing body parts, and the Titan Forged. Talk about transhumanism, am I right? Bastion and Maldraxxus had so much stuff that could have happened about identity and self-determination, I think we only scratched the surface of. All that to say, my question is, in your wildest dream and imaginings, what story could Warcraft tell that would not just be aesthetic level cyberpunk, but super really blanking cyberpunk? Matt, what do you think?
I mean, the thing about cyberpunk to me is that the ultimate core of the cyberpunk experience is that everything you just talked about in terms of humanism, transhumanism, like, the mind, what makes something real. Is a machine that can think a real person? Am I a real person? Will I still be a real person if I'm edited on the memory level? Like, there's lots of ideas like that, but the real ultimate core of it to me is simply that nothing is ever going to be like a really truly happy, everybody gets what they want ending in Cyberpunk. Things are always, there's a bleakness to it because there's always a cost. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes you have to pay the cost for other people's decisions. The wealthy and the powerful are almost always going to get away with the horrible things they do because they can. There's just a level of I don't want to say nihilism, but I don't know what else to call it. Existential, a comprehension of one's, how one is basically always threatened by things and forces that are beyond your control. In a weird sort of way, the fiction that is the most like cyberpunk is actually weird horror from the 20s and 30s, because there's that sense of there's these things that, like, it's like if you replace like Cthulhu with AIs, you basically have the same thing. This thing that is not something that thinks like you do or on a scale like you do, and does not think you are important enough to matter. There's an old poem by Stephen Crane the poem is, "A man said to the universe, 'Sir, I exist.' However, replied the universe, 'that fact has created in me no sense of obligation.'" Like, it's not even just an uncaring universe; it's a utterly uncaring universe. And you are grist that can be ground fine. You are spending your entire time dwelling not only in ignorance, but on the cusp of a soap bubble. So it's tonally, I don't think it goes well with Warcraft. That's not to say you couldn't do something where it was Cyberpunk inspired, but there is a bit of a mishmash here, and it's the same mishmash that you have when you compare, say, Lovecraft to Robert E. Howard. Because Robert E. Howard wrote a lot of cosmic horror stuff, just like Lovecraft did. But the difference is that when Howard was writing stuff, Howard believed in something that Lovecraft didn't, and that the cyberpunk people don't really believe in either. Like if you read William Gibson, like Lovecraft, believes that there's like you can break, you'll break people. The nature of the person is frangible. That you can split someone into little pieces and they can't go on and they don't recover from it. But Howard didn't believe that. Like if you put man into a horrible situation, sure, some people break. Some people go and break in a direction that requires just destroying everything in their path until they no longer feel threatened. And I feel like you could do a Lovecraft, you could do a cyberpunk version of Warcraft, but if it was still Warcraft, it would always end up with just like, for lack of a better word, the barricades go up, there's revolution in the streets, and the bastards are getting dragged out and burned. That's always going to happen in a Warcraft version of it. Like you'd have, like, I think Mechagon's a really good example. Mechagon is a cyberpunk dystopia.
Mm-hmm.
One person is in charge of the whole society, and he is just instituted. Everybody gets cybernetic implants, and I'm going to turn everybody in the world into something mechanical. And if they resist, they'll die. And in the end, what happens? He gets dethroned. It's a cyberpunk story idea that doesn't end like a cyberpunk story, because Warcraft is ultimately about that you can win. There's a victory condition and you can reach it.
Yeah, and I think that's really the big standout difference between cyberpunk and literally anything else genre wise is the fact that there can be a victory condition. Because I mean, going to cyberpunk, looking at the quote unquote best ending that you have available to you leaves you a shell as your former self, right? You don't have access to any of the things that made you who you were. You're basically left as a baseline human, and that is the best outcome because you're at least alive.
You're alive, and you're not at somebody else's beck and call. You're not waiting to die, and you're not trapped in a life you don't want.
Yeah, but that is ostensibly the only victory condition that Cyberpunk 2077 gives you. And in most of the tabletop role-playing scenarios for Cyberpunk, and even Shadowrun to a lesser degree maybe, is that there is no real victory condition. The victory condition at most is you survived another day. You survived to the next job. You survived.
The closest thing to a true victory condition is not only did you survive, you actually got paid.
Yeah. Whereas you look at,
and that's like, that's just you get paid for the initial job. Maybe it's just, it is a thing.
And then you look at Warcraft, and like Matt said, it's a little bit different. And Mechagon is probably really about as close as we will ever get to it. It is a story of a crisis of identity, a crisis of self. It is a story of a city cut off from the rest of the world. One that is living in that cyberpunk dystopia where you really can't do much aside from what the regime tells you to do, because if you do, you're just discarded like so much trash. I mean, literally, they throw people in the trash there. That's a whole thing. They're replacing body parts with other body parts to make things more perfect. There's this whole idea that they can, essentially reformat the entire world and make everybody, and I'm air quoting, perfect. And in Cyberpunk, that is a theme. You're chasing some form of perfection. At least half the people are. Just the regular day-to-day citizens, the ones that aren't doing the running. They aren't, doing their stuff with their back alley deals or talking to fixers to get jobs. The everyday citizen is either doing it for aesthetics or they're doing it to chase some form of perfection that they couldn't have without those prosthetics or without those modifications to their body. Mechagon was very much that same way. But again, Warcraft, you can have a victory condition. And sometimes it's bought dearly, which is sort of the trope of more the fantasy aspect of it. Great sacrifice begets the victory, right? So look at, why can't I think of his name now? The paladin that sacrificed himself. Oh, he held us to the top of Icecrown Citadel. Why can't I think of his name?
Tyrion Fordring?
Thank you. Tyrion Fordring. It's been a long day, folks. I haven't had nearly enough coffee. But Tyrion Fordring, at one point, he sacrifices himself. He's willing to sacrifice himself because that's what it takes to buy it. Varian sacrifices himself. Vol'jin puts himself in harm's way. You have all of these heroic figures that, yes, they die. Yes, it's tragic, but they do so that their factions, their friends, their compatriots can win. Whether it's battling the Legion back into the Nether and destroying it, cutting off the head, whether it's, taking over and breaking down the doors to Orgrimmar to get at Garrosh when he's lost all semblances of humanity, whether it's storming the Sanctum of Domination to defeat another war chief that has gone way off the deep end, or fighting against the jailer or trying to rally against some cosmic hope, we always win. That's what makes it Warcraft, is that there's a way to win.
Yeah, here's a really concise way to look at it. Look at, if you've seen Cyberpunk Edgerunners, David Martinez sacrifices himself so that most of his friends die and that his girlfriend manages to run away to the moon. And that's it. At the end of the day, the guy he sacrifices himself against is still around and kicking. Adam Smasher is still there. Arasaka is still exactly like it was. His mother is still dead. And, he got a little victory at the cost of his life, but everything is still pretty much the same. And there's that level of fatalism, of hopelessness, is something that is a major part of Cyberpunk and is not a major part of Warcraft. So the closest you can get is you can show people a place that's like a Cyberpunk setting, but then in the end, it's going to get fixed because you're heroes and heroes do that. You're not a hero playing Cyberpunk or playing even Shadowrun. You're not a hero. You
are a deeply flawed individual. You are not a hero. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. It is possible to have fantasy cyberpunk, but then you're really, at that point, you're just looking at steampunk, right?
I mean, it doesn't have to be steampunk. It can just be, like a good example of something that is closer is actually George R. R. Martin's The Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah.
That's just a lot closer to cyberpunk in that, kings and queens die, people are killed in the war, all this fighting happens. And in the books, at least, I can't speak to the series because they had to come up with an ending for it. But in the books, it's basically right now, it's for the past several years, it's just basically been in stasis, where the world is just there and nobody seems to be winning this thing. And the people on the ground are just like, yeah, well, it doesn't matter which lord is in charge of the place, it still sucks. It's much the same as in Cyberpunk. It's like, it doesn't matter which mega corporation is in charge, because it all sucks.
Yeah, it reminds me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail when they comes upon the commoners in the mud, like farming. Well, we don't care who's in charge. We're still going to be farming mud. Like it's kind of just how that is there, right? But I think that hopefully that answers your question. But I think we're going to move on, and we have, I think, time for probably one more here. Greetings, Matt and Joe. My question is related to Sargeras, specifically his aesthetic. I've always found it odd that Sargeras, the leader of the Burning Legion, is depicted as a being that's a flame with normal-looking orange elemental fire and not green fell fire. Obviously, this could just be a purely artistic decision, but I'd like to explore possible lore explanations you may have for this. Being a Titan, a being that's a true expression of order, perhaps becoming completely consumed by Fellfire just isn't possible. I mean, he can use Fell magic, clearly, but to become it, to biologically swing to the other side of the spectrum, so to speak, perhaps he fundamentally just can't. Or maybe it's not so much that he can't, but it's instead a conscious decision on his part not to. The Legion is, after all, an ordering of chaos. Perhaps he feels that he needs to not go full Fell for fear of losing his drive towards his endgame to utter, purposeless chaos. Interestingly, Aggramar shares the same aesthetic with Sargeras. That's another Fel-related Titan that doesn't look demonic at all. Coincidence? Odd that they can be surrounded by Fel magic for so long without it looking as though it had a typical corrupting effect on them. No? And this is from Necromar. I will say one thing real quick. Aggramar technically isn't a Fel Titan when we see him. He's just been brainwashed. So, a little bit different there. But do you have an opinion on that, Matt? Do you think there's a specific reason why he is not portrayed as being consumed by Fel?
I mean, this is the interesting thing to me is that we have become so, I don't know the proper word to use here, but we've become so convinced that Fel equals green. We've seen in Warcraft, we've been to a lot of Fel places. They're not all green. I mean, some of them are, but the green from the Fel equals green thing seems to come from originally the idea that the blood of Manaroth that the orcs drank was bright bilious green, and that seems to be where people thought, oh, okay. If you look at the Chaos orcs, who are straight up, they're full on vibing on the demon juice, they're bright red. They're not green. And I think that that's something to consider. Fel doesn't have to be green. For years, warlocks were using Fel fire, and they didn't have green fire.
Yeah, Fel fire was just fire.
Yeah. They then put in a quest for people to get it, and I'm totally cool with you having it, and I'm totally cool with Fel stuff being green, but I don't think it has to be. I don't think there's anything. I mean, there's plenty of stuff in nature that's green. Druids aren't felling it up. They're not out there going, be healed by the Fel. They're just healing it. They're using natural power. It's just happens to be green.
I think there's also an aspect of it where a lot of the warlock stuff for like the orc warlocks, a lot of the art, the key art was green. The Fel volcano in Draenor was green. There's a lot of green associated with things that are lumped in with Fel. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where some of that is coming as much.
But in terms of Sargeras, I don't think Sargeras' estate has anything to do, like that fire coming off of him was always in him. That's just the manifestation of him no longer being a balanced thing where his elemental natures are all tied together. Like, because he's this, ordinarily beforehand, if you go look at the original Sargeras before he started his descent, he's this giant, bronzy, coppery, golden giant figure. Made, and
he actually looks a lot like pre-corruption Neltharion.
Yeah, he's this big metal dude with smooth, flawless, polished skin. And I think what you're looking at with the other version of him is his rage coming out. Mm-hmm. He always had it because he was always the chief warrior of the Titans. It's just no longer, it's no longer a deep fire within him like the core of a planet. It's like, okay, now it's just like, it's like he's covered in volcanoes and his natural stuff is exploding out of him all the time. I don't think it's quote unquote Fel. He absolutely can channel the Fel. There's lots of pictures of him channeling it, but I don't think that form is based on it being Fel corruption coming out of him. I believe that form is the Fel corruption is splitting him open. And I go back again to looking at, since you mentioned Neltharion, look at Deathwing. When Deathwing, it's void stuff and not Fel, but still, he's got a lot of void stuff, but until like the very end, when he's like actually starting to have purple tentacles erupt out of him, he wasn't having stuff that was obviously void. He was just exploding. Like the internal fire of his nature was eating his body from the inside out. And I think it's the same thing with Sargeras. That's my theory. I don't have a lot to base this on aside from the occasional comment about it, but I definitely think, like, if you look at his face now, the horns that are erupting out of his head are like pure heat. Like those aren't there.
And he didn't have those beforehand. He did not have the horns when he was, his typical Titan form.
Yeah, and those horns that he has now are not actually there. Like physically speaking, he does not really have horns. They're like little promontories of like raw magma bubbling out of him. Much like the beard that Odin has isn't really a beard. Mm-hmm. It's elemental. It's like literally his face is melting constantly. I think it's like that. I think when a Titan or Titan Forged gets out of balance, their inner self starts to like show itself in disorder. Like a flaming beard on his face. Odin's evil, guys. Come on. Sorry, I just had to say that because it's true. Anyway, yeah, that's my take. Go ahead, Joe.
No, I think the thing that we need to focus on here is not that Fel makes things green, it's that Fel exacts change. It is a force of essentially destruction, that when two elements that are opposing come in contact with each other, right? It's when light and darkness touch each other and create the Fel. It's the destruction of that order, the destruction of that life energy, essentially, that exists. And so if you look at Sargeras's, like we said, his Titan form, he's a perfect being in that form. He is bronze and godlike and looks like a hero out of Mesopotamian lore at this point. Like he looks like a barbarian king, perfectly chiseled and in balance. And then look at some of the others that have come before, that have come as well from, we'll say, Fel corruption. Look at Archimonde. Look at Kil'jaeden. Archimonde isn't green. He's just a big blue version of himself. He can wield Fel and is seen oftentimes doing it, but he's just a larger version of himself. Kil'jaeden isn't green either. He's a giant winged horned Eridar, but he's fire. He's not green at all.
Yeah, but he can, again, just like Joe said, he can channel the Fel. You see him doing it all the time, but he's not, he's not a big green dude.
Yeah, and a lot of the depictions of Archimonde, of Sargeras being green and Fel has to do with his avatar, not him. The avatar that was created essentially out of essentially primordial Fel goop, for lack of a better term, because I really don't know how else to describe it. But yeah, that was just using Fel to craft a vessel for a portion of his soul to inhabit, but not him. So when you see him, his current form is one that is much altered. It is a perversion or a manifestation of how far he's fallen. And in some cases, that does turn into, you see that echoed across anything that's sufficiently Fel steeped. Whether it is the Fel volcanoes of Draenor, whether it is the surface of Argus, whether it is Felwood, all these places that were, corrupted or have been sort of bathed in that Fel energy. But also a lot of that has to do with demon blood too, where demon blood was spilled and it becomes a corrupting factor, where pools of demon blood were left behind and mutated or modified those around it. Yeah, that's going to have maybe a little bit of a green tinge to it because we're told that demon blood is green. And you see it a little bit too with the Illidari. When we go to the demon hunters, a lot of their stuff manifests as that as well because they essentially consume a demon, right? But it doesn't always look like that. Like, again, Illidan, who has consumed a lot of demonic energy at this point. Yeah, his runes glow green. Nothing else glows green on him. He is way altered from where he was, though. As a matter of fact, comparing Illidan to, Sargeras at this point might be more apt because of that sort of body altering effect it has. They altered in much of the similar ways. The only difference is Illidan's still keeping himself in check a little bit. Sargeras is letting his rage flow. He's letting it pulse through him. He's using it to a point where not only does it alter his physical appearance, but the fire bursts forth from him, making him into what he is. But again, you have to look at Fel as a mutating factor, not necessarily just green.
Yeah, another thing that's interesting, since you mentioned Kil'jaeden and Archimonde before, Kil'jaeden, when we see Kil'jaeden, every time he's made an appearance, he has been wreathed in flames.
Mm-hmm.
Good old-fashioned orange-red flames.
Mm-hmm.
Then comes out of the Sunwell. The Sunwell looks like a pool of fire. He's got fire coming out of his shoulders. He is, again, it's just, there's not a heck of a lot of green to it. So, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily that he's not corrupted by the Fel or he's not imbued with the Fel. I just think that it is not manifesting in that same way. Some of it seems to, like the Fel blasts that Sargeras used to carve out Illidan's eyes was green. The eyes he used to replace Illidan's eyes, they're green. So I think green is certainly a color that Fel can manifest as, but it's also a color it can manifest in other things.
Yeah,
like manifestations can use different colors.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just look at the druids. Look at nature magic. Look at the realm of the Emerald Dream. It's called the Emerald Dream, right? It's green. It's that same vibrant, pulsating green and everything that they do there. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a corruption. It's just a manifestation of power.
You might want to think about what that means, that, the healing force of nature can also be the force that causes rapid change. Mm-hmm. There's that whole idea of the fuse, that the force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age. That rot blasts the roots of trees is my destroyer. To use the poem, Dylan Thomas there. Sorry, but there's that idea that we've been talking from the beginning. The rainbow thing Joe talked about earlier when we were talking about Azeroth as an entity, and the idea that all these forces exist in counterrelation. Fel is essentially a goad and a spur. It is the thing that it forces you along a path. Like light reveals paths, the void conceals paths and is the force of kind of potential. But Fel is the thing that kicks you down a path. Just like Arcane is the thing that orders a path. It's the thing that creates, okay, this is now intelligible. We can see how this progresses. Fel is like, I don't care how it progresses. Go, go, go. That's why it's so opposed to Arcane. That's why they are almost antithetical to each other. One is the methodical moving from point to point, and the other is, let's just leapfrog everything and see what you look like with tentacles and wings. Yeah, that's how that went. Fel is a way to shortcut change.
Yeah, and I think part of it also, too, is early depictions of Fel in the games and even in the books and the role-playing game as well was a little bit different than it is now. Fel has definitely evolved over the years to being what it currently is, but canonically, part of that is just our lack of understanding about it. The early warlocks were essentially mages that used demon's blood, right? They learned how to essentially embrace the Fel by using demon's blood to essentially break down the strict barriers of order, but still using that magic essentially filtered through it. And that was what the path of corruption was when you talk about the tabletop role-playing game, when you talk about the early manga, the early comic books, the early portrayals of the orcs, particularly Gul'dan and his warlocks that he had on his Shadow Council. You have sort of this idea that was what it was, but now as we get older and as we move our way through the storyline, we're realizing that it's just our limited exposure to it that made us believe that was all that Fel was. Fel is so much more. When we discovered that it was sort of these two forces colliding and being broken down, it became its own thing. It is its own thing. And you have to look at it as just that force of change. Felwood does have a green tinge to it, but it's more about the mutation, right?
And the demon blood that caused Felwood to be that way in the first place.
And the demon blood that caused that mutation. You look at other things that are exposed to Fel, and you look at that rapid mutation, you look at that change, you look at the shifting of the physical form. That's what it is. And we talk about it being a corrupting force. Yes, it is a corrupting force in so much that it is in much the same way of radiation.
Fel, that's actually a really good metaphor for it, because we can obviously use radioactive materials to do all sorts of really great stuff, but if you're not careful with it, you get a demon core incident. You get irradiated, all your cells get destroyed, and you die horribly. Fel, you can very easily, if you misuse the Fel, if you use it without caution, without care for what it can do, it can absolutely destroy you. It can turn you into a thing you couldn't even understand. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that Fel is good and you should go around using it any chance you get, but it also doesn't mean that it has to be demonic.
And speaking to that level of devastation here too, there is one thing that I do want to put a whisper in your ear or a nugget for you to think about. Every force in the cosmology of Azeroth and everything that we've known so far can do the exact same thing. It just looks different. Order imposes and reshapes, right? But it still reshapes. It still does it makes something in its own image or makes it be a very specific way. Nature running rampant does the same thing. We've seen that multiple times. We saw it with the Everbloom. We see it with basically unfettered access to the Emerald Dream and what would happen if nature was not left somewhat in check with how we have it. It would just overrun everything. Look at the monstrosities that get created when there's too many plants consuming that anima, that spirit, and run over a planet. The light does the same thing. So does the void. Look at the lands that the light has blasted. Look at Revendreth. And yes, that was a war, but it has completely polluted and changed that landscape. You can look at Argus and look what happened with a void chunk that was completely consumed by it. If we ever get to Koresh, you'll see the same thing. All of these forces have a strong pull. Fel is just another one of them at this point. Its origin just feel like it's portrayed more of a corruption than maybe the other ones are thought to be. But I would argue that almost all of those forces are just as powerful at corrupting or exacting change if they so choose. I think that's it from my thoughts. Do you have anything you want to add, Matt?
No, I think I pretty much covered what I was thinking.
Well then, friends, Blizzard Watch is made possible due to the generous contributions of patreon.com/BlizzardWatch. Your continued support means this podcast site and community is able to thrive and grow. Blizzard Watch supporters enjoy exclusive benefits like your early access to the podcast, better chance at having your question answered on our podcast with a queue, and an ads-free site experience. Again, friends, if you have any questions for this or any of our podcasts, be sure to send those into podcast@blizzardwatch.com. Specify the show that it is for and any special pronunciation of your name. If you can hit us up on Discord as well, we have the Q and Podcast Questions channel where you can go ahead and put your questions in. Same rules apply. And if you are a Patreon subscriber, not only do you get early access to our show, that ads-free site experience, but we look at your questions first in our patron Q and Podcast Questions channel. And with that, folks, we'll see you next week.